If there's one church which gave Paul a run for his money, it was the one in Corinth. Now, some of the churches that he founded, he was able to go get things started, and just every once in a while he'd need to send them a brief letter kind of correcting them in one way or another, and the notes didn't need to be very long. But we see in the New Testament that Paul devotes more of his correspondence, more of his writing, more words to Corinth than anywhere else. And he uses all that verbiage to correct and to challenge, sometimes to chastise them, sometimes even to lash out at them. Paul can be sarcastic in Corinthians sometimes. And it's all because the Corinthians are so good at going so far astray. Not only that, but in 1 Corinthians, Paul refers to an earlier letter. So we know that 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. And what we think of as 2 Corinthians, most scholars think is a big anthology of a collection of letters because Paul goes in so many different directions. All of this to say, there may have been 5 or 6 letters that Paul had to send to the Corinthians. And this in an era when paper and ink and writing utensils were expensive, and you had to pay a messenger to send it. So you chose your words carefully, and you saved them for when they were really necessary. Apparently, Paul was always had something necessary to correct the Corinthians with. And it's easy to see why. Corinth in the first century was a bustling town. Something like modern-day London or New York. It was the hub of the primary trading network in the ancient world. Caravans would come down from within Greece. Ships would come from east and west and from south, from Egypt to North Africa. Everybody was in Corinth. Every culture, every kind of idea. And on one level, this was exciting because it brought people into contact with countless people and cultures and philosophies. You could get any kind of food. And you start to get the picture of what kind of a place Corinth was. There likely had never been a place like Corinth before. A meeting ground for so many worldviews. And the early church was right there in the thick of it all. But what happens in a church as diverse as Corinth? Well, you end up with Greeks who know Plato and the great philosophers. You have Egyptians who've been to the great library in Alexandria and they've read the ancient wisdom. You have Roman soldiers who want to fight and stand up for something. And then you have merchants. These are people persons who like shaking hands and making deals and serving customers. You have Jews who know God's ancient law. You have government officials and bureaucrats who like order and right process. In short, you have a big, complicated collection of people who don't always see things the same way and who experience the world differently. They have different outlooks on what's important in life, and critically they understand God and will probably experience God in different ways. Now we could get into Corinthians and all the different ways that they went astray, but I think there's a baseline problem that so many people, it's not a problem, it's really a blessing, but it does cause problems because so many people were different. And so they fight and they bicker, they argue, they put forward their faction's position as the right one, and they put down how other people have come to encounter Jesus as being unimportant or saying that they're missing the point. So Paul struggles to hold the walls of that church together, and he battles some pretty horrible battles along the way. Paul wants all his congregation to rise above the fray, to receive spiritual wisdom. He wants them to see God and experience God in a real way that is close. What I think is remarkable about Paul's Corinthian church is really how much it's like most churches. I mean, every church is made up of people who love God and who want God's love or God's real presence to be manifest in the lives of everyone. And that's just where the trouble starts, because people encounter God in unique ways. Depending on your personality, how you see the world, your upbringing, what tradition you come out of, there are so many things that factor into how you see God. But behind it all is a desire for a first-hand experience of God. In 2004, Upper Room came out with a study which explored how people tends to experience God. And they found that people can be generally grouped into one of 4 spiritual types. And each of these types depend upon whether you're more introverted or whether you're more extroverted. And along the same lines, there's a second axis which measures how much you experience God based upon thought and intellect versus how much you experience God based upon emotions or feelings of the heart. Each type is unique in how they understand and experience God, and we're going to spend the next few weeks emphasizing each type in our worship, and we're going to explore them in depth. In doing so, I hope that you will come to understand your own spirituality in a fuller way, and I hope we'll have some fun along the way. Maybe you'll understand why you like singing and you don't like Bible studies. Maybe you'll see why potlucks are next to godliness to you, and you'll also understand why the person sitting next to you sees potlucks as being a waste of time. So let's delve in. And I want to just give a quick overview today, and then I'm going to send you home with a few thoughts and ideas so that we can really go deeper in the weeks ahead. So the first spiritual type are the theologians. You can also call them teachers or sages. If we were to pick out a patron saint for theologians, it would be this guy on the next slide. Because theologians love logic. Theologians are marked by thinking and intellectual spirituality. To theologians, reason and faith go hand in hand. If you're a theologian, you probably like Bible studies, or you like to learn how to intricately examine and unpack little-known passages of Scripture. Theologians enjoy sermons and lectures. They like having long conversations about some little-known point of doctrine. We're actually in the Protestant church at the tail end of an era when theologians reigned supreme. And out of that era came the Methodist movement. Consider this, at the heyday of the Enlightenment, when the Methodist movement started, this is the time of John Wesley, our founding father. A sermon might last 45 minutes if the preacher wanted to be brief. If you're a theologian, that might sound like heaven, but to the rest of us, well, that sounds more like the opposite place. We need theologians, though. Maybe more now than ever, because in an era when Christians are seen as anti-intellectual, we need people who know how to love God with all their minds. But you see, the problem is when we take this too far, that it makes faith become dry and over-intellectual. Sometimes theologians, in moments when they are just trying to explain a doctrine or a moral concept, can bore people, or worse yet, they can step on people with their conclusions. Oftentimes there isn't room in their conclusions for emotions, because emotions aren't reasonable. So there's a second group. But first, our patron saint, Mr. Spock here. Remember how he and Dr. McCoy would argue? It's because McCoy had too much of a heart to buy into pure logic. Well, that's what irritates people about theologians. It's because reason and logic can only be taken so far. So there is a second group. There are those who can't get purely behind a theological approach. They need room for emotion, for issues of the heart, not just the head. And these people experience God through other people. In fact, they are people persons. The second type of people, let's call them caregivers, experience God by way of their heart. These people are usually the church's cheerleaders. They get excited when it comes time for passing of the peace because they can shake hands, or more likely, they're the ones who give hugs. Our patron saint for caregivers would be this guy. Because who could be more of a caring person? He's excited to see you. He lets you sit on his lap. He comes to your home for no other reason than to give you a present. Caregivers experience God as a nurturing parent. They're passionate and they don't hide their emotions. If a caregiver is sitting through a sermon, it had better be loud and passionate. It better get your heart beating. And it better be short so that we can get back to the handshaking and the hugging after church is over. And let's face it, for caregivers, the worship service is just the setting of the stage for the fellowship that comes with brunch afterwards. Caregivers understand that Jesus came to be with people, to love them and spend time with them. Caregivers value people. Maybe they even value them a little bit too much. Because caregivers are also the kind of people who are too busy loving people to be organized or to have a clean office. They might shy away from telling hard truths if the truth would hurt. They can be impulsive and free-spirited to the extreme. We need caretakers in the church, but alongside them we need people who know how to organize. We need people who can tell hard truths, who know how to speak truth to power. We need people who can challenge the injustice that's out there in the world. Let's call this third type crusaders. If you read about the prophets in the Old Testament, or about Jesus throwing out the money changers in the temple, then you start to understand what makes a crusader tick. Crusaders experience God by standing up for the things and for the people that God is concerned about. They're willing to take on the powerful and stand up for the meek. The patron saint of the crusader would have to be, well, I couldn't name just one, but just think of your favorite superhero. These are my two favorite superheroes. You have Batman and also Storm from the X-Men. And I only choose those because I've always wanted a Batmobile, and I just think it would be cool to be able to whip up a hurricane at a moment's notice. Every crusader sees him or herself as a superhero, battling evil, fighting injustice, fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. They're the idealists. But churches can't have too many crusaders. Usually they're the smallest group. And it's good because otherwise the church wouldn't stay together very long. Often the crusader can be the least popular person in the church. I mean, think about some of the great crusaders of our time. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They weren't popular people in their time. Two of those people wound up dead. And the other two were frequently in jail because of what they were standing up for. It's not easy, and it rarely makes you many friends to stand up to the institutions of this world and to label them as evil. Sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable, and sometimes it even makes them angry. Like I mentioned earlier, Jesus' quintessential crusader moment is when he's in the temple overturning the tables of the money changers. Did you know that in some of the Gospels, that is the precise moment when the religious authorities start plotting to have him killed? It's rarely safe to be a crusader. Furthermore, crusaders can be obnoxious, and they can be self-righteous. When you take them to the extreme, you end up with some nut with a bullhorn telling people they're going to hell. And they can neglect their inner life and their close friendships so that they only focus on their cause. Now, we need crusaders in the church to keep us constantly looking out on the world and challenging it, challenging the systems of this world that step on people. But we need people, and we need people who stand in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. But we also need people who can bring us back to the inner world, the world of the soul. And for that we need people who we will call mystics. Mystics are captivated by the quiet, unseen, almost unknowable realm in which God exists in each of us. Mystics are introspective and intuitive. They're intrigued by the mystery of God. When they pray, they don't care so much about what they say as they do about the quiet groanings they perceive coming from God. They push the envelope of what spirituality means. Perhaps the best saint for the mystics would be this person. Because mystics look to someone who's wise and timeless, who's part of this world but seems to have a foot in another world as well. If you feel God's presence in small, seemingly ordinary moments, then you might be a mystic. Mystics are sometimes mistaken for being shy or quiet, but that's usually because they're interested in understanding God in ways that are deeper than words can express. Mystics make us Protestants a little bit uncomfortable because we've worshipped at the altar of reason a little too long. And maybe we would do well to remember that there are some things about God that go beyond what our minds can comprehend. I'm especially excited about our worship 2 Sundays from now because we'll be focusing on mystic spirituality. And there's so much of this tradition that's so rich and so much a part of Christianity, and has been for so long. But most of us Protestants have ignored it, and it will seem like something that's new and exciting. The danger for mystics is that they never really leave their spiritual bubble, that they become navel-gazers who lose touch with this world. But when mystics come together with crusaders and with caregivers and even those boring theologians, What a remarkable community it really makes. One where it's difficult to make people get along, but one which changes the world. This community called the church, which is unlike anything the world has ever known, is a collection of all these different types. It's an expression of God's preference for diversity. Maybe we're like the Corinthians. We can't get along because we're one type and we don't fully appreciate the others. You know, I had a kid in one of the churches I served who, shortly after I got there, he stopped coming. And I sat down with him one day for lunch, and I just wanted him to know that we missed him, and I was afraid I'd done something wrong. But he was one spiritual type that didn't find any expression in the group, and frankly doesn't find much expression in the church. He was this last type. He was a mystic. And so what he ended up doing was he couldn't find that in the church he was at, and he ended up going to a different religion outside of the Christian church. That's the danger of what happens when we lose appreciation for one kind of spiritual type, for one kind of people. You see, there's room for every type in the Christian family. In fact, if we ignore or exclude one, we are making the church incomplete. And even as individuals, maybe each of us have a primary type, but if we're going to be healthy, we need to experience God through all four. We're at our best as the church when all four kinds of people work together, when we get over our bickering and we come together for common cause. That shows the world something it's never seen. And it shows the fullness of the God that we worship. For our response today, I want the ushers to distribute a little quiz. Some of you already have it. It's in the back of the room. But I want y'all to just take this home. It's 13 questions. It looks like a quiz you could get in a magazine. Don't overthink it. But just this week, take 5 minutes and take this little quiz. Find out what your spiritual type is. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to explore that. Not only that, but find out which of your spiritual types is your lowest. I'll just tell you now, I'm not a caregiver. Okay? That is not my type. But maybe that's the Sunday that I need to be in church and focus the most, because even if that's not my primary type, if that's the one that I'm the lowest at, there's still that part of me, and I need to be able to express that as well. So go ahead and take the quiz this week. Come back with whatever your type is. We'll get this maybe out on the website so that if people aren't here, they can take it as well. We'll give just a minute for the ushers to finish distributing. But as you're taking it, understand this. You know that person in the church who irritates you beyond all measure? Maybe it's not just that they're a bad person or they like getting under your skin. Maybe they experience God in a way that you never thought about before. Maybe we could all think about that a little bit more. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. As we close today,